Upton Sinclair was a California writer and a complex literary figure who became one of the most controversial authors of the 20th century. Upton Beale Sinclair Jr., novelist, journalist, and later political activist, was born in Baltimore, Maryland on September 20, 1878. He came from a family of contrasts. He had a distinctive intensity with his piercing gaze and serious demeanor. Sinclair's early years were marked by poverty and ambition. His father was an alcoholic liquor salesman who struggled to provide for the family, while his mother came from a wealthy background but had married beneath her station. This dichotomy between poverty and privilege shaped young Upton's worldview and would influence his writing throughout his career. Sinclair was a precocious child who learned to read at an early age. By the time he was 5 years old, he was devouring books with an appetite that would never diminish. His family moved frequently as his father chased employment opportunities, exposing young Upton to different environments and social classes. He spent time with his wealthy maternal grandparents in Baltimore, where he witnessed the lifestyle of the privileged, then returned to cramped apartments where his father's drinking consumed what little money the family had. At the age of 14, Sinclair entered the City College of New York. He was remarkably young for a college student, but his intellectual abilities were undeniable. To support himself and help his family, he began writing stories for pulp magazines and newspapers. He would write jokes, adventure stories, and serialized fiction, sometimes producing as many as 8,000 words per day. This early experience taught him discipline and speed in writing, though it also instilled habits that critics would later cite as weaknesses in his more serious work. Sinclair graduated from City College in 1897 and briefly attended Columbia University to study law, but he quickly realized that his true calling was literature, not legal practice. He wanted to be a serious novelist, not a hack writer churning out pulp fiction for pennies. He began working on his first serious novel, drawing on his experiences and observations of American society. In 1901, he published Springtime and Harvest, a novel about a young man's romantic and spiritual awakening. The book received little attention and sold poorly, but it represented Sinclair's first attempt at the kind of socially conscious literature he would become known for. The following years were difficult for Sinclair. He married Meta Fuller in 1900, and they had a son, David, in 1901. Sinclair struggled to support his family through his writing. He continued to produce novels, including The Journal of Arthur Sterling in 1903 and Manassas in 1904, but none achieved commercial success. He was developing his craft and his political consciousness, but he was also sinking deeper into debt and frustration. Sinclair's political views were evolving during this period. He had been raised in a conservative Southern family, but his experiences with poverty and his extensive reading led him toward socialism. He joined the Socialist Party in 1902, convinced that capitalism was the root cause of the poverty and inequality he had witnessed throughout his life. This political commitment would define his career and his legacy. In 1904, the editor of a socialist newspaper called Appeal to Reason commissioned Sinclair to write a novel about the lives of immigrant workers in Chicago's meatpacking industry. The editor provided Sinclair with a $500 advance, and Sinclair traveled to Chicago to conduct research. For 7 weeks, he lived among the workers in the Packingtown district, touring slaughterhouses, interviewing workers, and documenting the brutal conditions in which they labored. What Sinclair witnessed in Chicago shocked and horrified him. The meatpacking plants were nightmarish places where workers toiled in dangerous conditions for poverty wages. Men lost fingers and limbs to machinery. They worked in rooms where the temperature was below freezing or in others where the heat was unbearable. The plants were filthy, with rats running freely and contaminated meat being processed for human consumption. Workers had no job security, no benefits, and no recourse when they were injured or cheated by their employers. Sinclair returned from Chicago determined to expose these conditions to the American public. He began writing what would become The Jungle, serializing it in Appeal to Reason beginning in February 1905. The novel told the story of Jurgis Rudkus, a Lithuanian immigrant who comes to America full of hope and optimism, only to be ground down by the brutal realities of industrial capitalism. Through Jurgis and his family, Sinclair depicted the exploitation, poverty, and despair that characterized the lives of working-class immigrants in America's industrial cities. The Jungle was Sinclair's attempt to create a socialist novel that would awaken the American public to the injustices of capitalism. He filled the book with graphic descriptions of working conditions, industrial accidents, political corruption, and corporate greed. The final chapters of the novel presented socialism as the solution to these problems, with Jurgis finding redemption and purpose in the socialist movement. When the serialization was complete, Sinclair sought a publisher for the book version. He was rejected by 5 major publishers who found the content too controversial and disturbing. Finally, Doubleday, Page and Company agreed to publish the novel, but only after sending investigators to Chicago to verify Sinclair's claims. The investigators confirmed that conditions were as bad as Sinclair had described, if not worse. The Jungle was published in book form in February 1906, and it became an immediate sensation. However, the public reaction was not what Sinclair had expected or intended. He had written the book to expose the exploitation of workers and to promote socialism, but readers were more horrified by his descriptions of unsanitary conditions in meat processing than by the plight of the workers. The passages describing rats being ground into sausage, diseased cattle being slaughtered for beef, and workers falling into rendering tanks and being processed along with animal carcasses captured the public imagination and sparked outrage. President Theodore Roosevelt read the book and was disturbed enough to launch an investigation into the meatpacking industry. The investigation confirmed Sinclair's allegations, leading to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act in 1906. These laws established federal oversight of food safety and marked a significant expansion of government regulation of industry. Sinclair had succeeded in changing American law and policy, but not in the way he had intended. He famously remarked, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach." The success of The Jungle made Sinclair wealthy and famous, but it also typecast him as a muckraking journalist rather than a serious novelist. He would spend the rest of his career trying to replicate the impact of The Jungle while also attempting to be recognized as a literary artist. He published dozens of books over the following decades, tackling various industries and social issues with the same exposé approach that had made The Jungle successful. In 1907, Sinclair used his earnings from The Jungle to establish Helicon Home Colony, a utopian community in Englewood, New Jersey. The colony was based on socialist principles and was intended to free intellectuals and artists from domestic drudgery through communal living and shared household duties. The experiment attracted writers, professors, and other intellectuals, but it lasted only a few months before the main building burned down in March 1907. The fire was suspected to be arson, possibly set by local residents who were hostile to the colony's socialist ideals. Sinclair's personal life was as turbulent as his political activities. His marriage to Meta Fuller deteriorated, in part due to the strains of poverty and his obsessive dedication to his work. They divorced in 1911. The following year, he married Mary Craig Kimbrough, a Southern belle from Mississippi who shared his socialist convictions. The marriage was happier than his first, and Mary Craig became his partner in his political and literary endeavors. In 1915, Sinclair moved to California, which would be his home for the rest of his life. He settled in Pasadena and continued his prolific output of novels, plays, and political tracts. He wrote The Prophets of Religion in 1918, attacking organized religion as a tool of capitalist oppression. He wrote The Brass Check in 1919, exposing corruption and bias in journalism. He wrote The Goose Step in 1923 and The Goslings in 1924, criticizing the American education system. Each book followed the same pattern: extensive research, shocking revelations, and calls for radical reform. Sinclair's novels during this period were less successful than his muckraking exposés. He wrote Oil in 1927, a novel based on the Teapot Dome scandal that explored corruption in the petroleum industry. The book was well received and was later adapted into the acclaimed film There Will Be Blood, though the adaptation bore little resemblance to Sinclair's novel. He wrote Boston in 1928, a novel about the Sacco and Vanzetti case that defended the 2 anarchists who had been executed for murder in what many believed was a miscarriage of justice. In 1934, Sinclair made his most serious foray into politics by running for governor of California as a Democrat. He had switched his party affiliation from Socialist to Democrat, believing he had a better chance of winning as a major party candidate. His campaign was based on a program called End Poverty in California, or EPIC, which proposed radical reforms including state-run cooperatives, pension plans, and public ownership of idle factories and farmland. The EPIC campaign attracted enormous support from working-class and unemployed Californians who were suffering through the Great Depression. Sinclair won the Democratic primary, shocking the political establishment. His general election campaign became a national sensation, attracting support from progressives across the country and fierce opposition from business interests, newspapers, and conservative politicians. His opponents launched what many historians consider the first modern smear campaign, using fabricated newsreels, misleading advertisements, and personal attacks to portray Sinclair as a dangerous radical who would destroy California's economy. The campaign was brutal and innovative, pioneering many of the negative campaigning techniques that would become standard in American politics. Sinclair was attacked for his atheism, his socialism, his past writings, and his personal life. Movie studios threatened to leave California if he was elected. Newspapers published distorted versions of passages from his novels, taken out of context to make him appear to advocate violence and immorality. Despite his grassroots support, Sinclair lost the election to Republican Frank Merriam, though he received nearly 900,000 votes. The defeat was devastating for Sinclair, but he returned to writing with characteristic energy. In 1940, he began what would become his most commercially successful work, the Lanny Budd series. These novels followed the adventures of Lanny Budd, the son of an American arms manufacturer, as he traveled through Europe and became involved in the major political events of the early 20th century. The series eventually comprised 11 novels published between 1940 and 1953. The third novel in the series, Dragon's Teeth, published in 1942, won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. The book dealt with the rise of Nazism in Germany and was praised for its historical accuracy and political insight. The Pulitzer Prize vindicated Sinclair's claims to be a serious novelist, though critics noted that the Lanny Budd novels were more successful as historical chronicles than as works of literary art. Sinclair was never primarily concerned with literary style or psychological depth. His goal was always to educate and persuade readers about political and social issues. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, Sinclair continued writing, though his influence and relevance were waning. The political landscape had changed dramatically. The New Deal had implemented many reforms that Sinclair had advocated, reducing the urgency of his message. The Cold War made socialism increasingly unpopular in America, and Sinclair's radical politics seemed outdated to a new generation. He published his autobiography in 1962, reflecting on his long career and his role in American social and political movements. Sinclair's personal life in his later years was marked by loss. His second wife, Mary Craig, died in 1961 after a long illness. Sinclair married Mary Elizabeth Willis in 1961, when he was 83 years old. His health was declining, but his mind remained sharp. He continued to write letters, give interviews, and comment on current events. He lived long enough to see the civil rights movement and the protests against the Vietnam War, which he supported as consistent with his lifelong commitment to social justice. On November 25, 1968, Upton Sinclair died in a nursing home in Bound Brook, New Jersey. He was 90 years old. He had lived through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and the social upheavals of the 1960s. He had published more than 90 books and countless articles, pamphlets, and letters. He had influenced American politics and policy, particularly through the jungle's impact on food safety regulation. He had run for political office multiple times and had been a prominent voice for socialism and social reform for more than 6 decades. Sinclair's legacy is complex and contested. He was unquestionably one of the most important American writers of the 20th century in terms of political and social impact. The Jungle remains his most enduring work, still read in schools and still cited in debates about food safety, labor rights, and corporate regulation. His other muckraking books, while less famous, documented important aspects of American society and influenced reform movements in religion, journalism, and education. As a novelist, however, Sinclair's reputation is more limited. Literary critics have generally dismissed his work as propaganda rather than art. His novels are criticized for wooden characters, heavy-handed political messages, and lack of stylistic sophistication. Sinclair himself acknowledged that he was more interested in social change than in literary excellence. He once said that he wrote to change the world, not to entertain readers or impress critics. Modern historians and critics have been somewhat kinder to Sinclair than his contemporary literary establishment was. They recognized that his documentary approach and his commitment to exposing social injustice were valuable contributions to American letters, even if his novels lacked the artistic qualities of his more celebrated contemporaries like F. Scott Fitzgerald or Ernest Hemingway. They note that his influence extended beyond literature into politics, journalism, and social activism. The debate over Sinclair's legacy reflects broader questions about the purpose of literature and the relationship between art and politics. Should writers prioritize aesthetic excellence or social impact? Can a novel be both great literature and effective propaganda? Sinclair never doubted his own answers to these questions. He believed that writers had a moral obligation to use their talents to expose injustice and advocate for change. He measured his success not by literary awards or critical praise, but by his impact on society and politics. Perhaps the most fitting assessment of Upton Sinclair comes from his own conception of his role as a writer. He saw himself as a crusader for social justice, using the novel as a weapon in the fight against capitalism and exploitation. He succeeded in changing laws, influencing public opinion, and documenting important aspects of American life. Whether he succeeded in creating lasting literature remains debatable, but his impact on American society and politics is undeniable. Sinclair represents a particular type of American writer, the engaged intellectual who uses literature as a tool for social reform. History is full of such figures, writers who prioritize message over style and impact over artistry. Sinclair's tragedy, if it can be called that, was that he achieved his political goals but not his literary ambitions. He changed American food safety laws but never won the literary recognition he craved. In the end, Upton Sinclair was neither a great novelist nor a mere propagandist, but rather a committed activist who used fiction as a vehicle for social criticism and reform. His legacy includes both the jungle's lasting impact on American policy and his less successful attempts to replicate that achievement in other areas. He is remembered today primarily for one book and for his political activism, which is perhaps unfair to a man who wrote prolifically for 7 decades and who dedicated his life to fighting for social justice. Sinclair remained until his death a man of conviction, remembered for his political commitments and his most famous novel rather than for the full scope of his literary output and his tireless advocacy for the poor and exploited.